Thied, Senior Vice President of Life Sciences and Healthcare at New York City Economic Development Corporation. In his prior life, Doug worked exclusively with life science companies using software and technology services to address critical business issues. He has worked with leading life science companies to launch products, solve challenges, and scale businesses. He's here to talk about the mayor's $500 million program in Life Sci New York, which is expected to create nearly 16,000 new jobs, many accessible to New Yorkers without advanced degrees. Welcome, Doug, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Nancy. I appreciate the introduction. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
I hear you fine.
All right. Mitch, thanks as well. Pleasure to be here. And I think this is the third year of your conference that EDC's been a part of it. So pleased to be invited, and I think my colleague Carlo is going to be moderating one of the panels next year. So thanks for everything in pulling this together, as well as to your broader teams. So as Nancy mentioned, my name is Doug Thiede. I'm the Senior Vice President of Life Sciences and Healthcare at New York City's Economic Development Corporation. For those who are unfamiliar with NYC EDC, we're the city's go-to vehicle for driving growth of affordable, sustainable, and economically vibrant neighborhoods. We want to invest in industries that will boost our economy. Economic development used to be about attracting new companies, but these days it goes well beyond creating jobs. It's about planning the growth of the city and an environment where businesses want to grow and where workers can get ahead. It's my team's job to work closely with the New York City life sciences community to encourage innovation, company formation, job training, and paths for companies to start, stay, and grow in New York City. By investing in this industry, we have the potential to diversify New York City's economy, provide job opportunities for New Yorkers, and eventually bring medicines and treatments that were invented in New York City to patients all over the world. Nancy and Mitch explained that today's audience spans a wide spectrum, and given that some may be new to life sciences or new to New York City, so I'll spend some time explaining why New York City is interested in the space, what's happened to date on the initiative that Nancy mentioned, share the outline of that plan, and then reference some of our progress to date and why we remain excited about the potential in life sciences. I think if Samantha and the team can pull up slides. Perfect. If we could advance to the first slide. So why New York City? Why are we interested in life sciences? For a start, we have some of the key ingredients to developing a successful market. We have an incredible foundation of basic scientific research that can lead to cutting edge innovation. This comes from our academic medical centers and research and development foundations. The evidence of this innovation shows itself annually as New York City is consistently number 2 in NIH funding, topping over $2 billion annually. New York City has world-leading healthcare throughout its hospital systems and community health centers. Eric alluded to this in the last presentation, but no greater evidence of this than our local response since March, where both our public health system and private hospitals were able to face the hardest pandemic of our generation. At the root of this, we have an incredible talent base in New York City, a strong university system, 7,000 postdocs, and 500,000 healthcare workers that give us an incredible baseline to grow and scale both life sciences and healthcare innovation. Our history in this industry goes way back to Pfizer, which started in Brooklyn over 170 years ago. As Pfizer continues their growth into one of the largest global pharmaceutical companies of the world, they're now leading some of the COVID response and remain at the center of life science activity in New York City. While Pfizer may have moved from Brooklyn to Midtown, they remain an important part of this real estate footprint, as in a few years, they'll move over to Hudson Yards. For years, New York City has made efforts to be a top destination for life sciences. But in order to make New York City that destination, entrepreneurs and research scientists needed to see a path to start and build a company here. And that showed that further investment was required. You could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. There are a number of important things required to build a market in life sciences. New York City has so many of these ingredients to thrive. At the heart of it, you need great science. New York City has had a long track record of top science. Once you have a good idea, you need the support system to advance that idea, the right talent, funding, and real estate to advance scientific discoveries. Surrounding this diagram are some of the data points that showed life science could flourish with additional focus and capital. Despite New York City being the financial capital of the world, dollars just weren't going into scientific ideas from a commercial perspective as were in other parts of the country. EDC launched 2 programs to support early stage entrepreneurs, SBIR Impact and eLab NYC, which allowed founders to get direct funding for grant support, coaching and mentorship on business plans, eventually to help raise capital. Over 300 applicants eventually went through these programs, raised money, and in many cases led to a greater case for additional life science facilities. As entrepreneurs formed these companies, they needed access to wet labs. The space is expensive and was hard to come by in New York City. A need for wet lab incubators, which is shared space for the scientific community, was validated by the success of both SUNY downstate, an incubator in Brooklyn, and Harlem Biospace in Manhattanville. Perhaps no more validation that this industry could bloom in New York City was the arrival of Alexandria Real Estate Equities and the growth of the East and West Towers of 728,000 square feet of Class A lab and office space, which dates back to an opening in 2010. With very careful and strategic investments in life sciences infrastructure and programming through 2016, New York City now had evidence to work with. The challenge was translating that evidence and other metrics into action. There were 2 studies in 2016 that made a call to arms to invest in life sciences infrastructure. The first was New York City's infrastructure initiative, and the second was the Partnership for New York's 2016 Commercial Life Sciences Report. You can find both of these on lifesci.nyc or the Partnership for New York website. Amongst many findings, the Partnership for New York is often quoted by pointing out that venture dollars were not following the NIH dollars at the rate that other key life science markets saw. We had a gap and needed to solve those needs. The infrastructure study showed that in order to spur growth, additional investment in real estate, infrastructure, and specialized space would be critical for commercial activity. Next slide, please. With this evidence in mind, New York City and Mayor de Blasio in December of 2016 launched Sci NYC. You may remember that this was rolled out in the same week as Governor Cuomo's life science plan that Eric just mentioned. Through Sci NYC, we are investing in the infrastructure, real estate, funding, and talent to give companies line of sight to start and stay in New York City at all stages of growth. We wanted to do this by supporting the growth of an estimated 16,000 jobs and creating up to 3 million square feet of new space for life science companies and researchers. Ultimately, we set a goal to set out a critical mass of commercial R&D, allowing for self-sustaining growth. Below is the high-level breakout of how we do it. $150 million committed to city capital through infrastructure, research and development facilities, and campuses that can capture company growth. This would be augmented both by city land and tax incentives. The tax incentives were a $300 million commitment in tax abatements designed to help developers and companies with the high cost of lab space, which equated to $250 to $450 per square foot more than regular office fit outs. This was to encourage both retrofits and new builds and allow for new wet lab space. We issued a clarification of zoning memos, allowing for both commercial and manufacturing zones to be used for life sciences. I suspect next week we'll hear about that more on the panel that Brooks will be leading. And then $50 million to support entrepreneurs, companies, talent, and funding through programming initiatives. While I won't focus on this column much today, I can't stress the importance of these investments in building our ecosystem. Next slide. Before we get into more of the real estate activity, I want to take a few minutes to touch on the community that exists and why it matters. While entrepreneurs and young companies need great science, talent, funding, and real estate, they also need community. They need this for advice, best practices, recruiting, and sharing ideas. In New York City, we're lucky to have a tremendous community that is interested in elevating the broader ecosystem. While this list is by no means exhaustive, some of these entities help company and community growth, whether it's accelerators such as Endless Frontier Labs, BioVenture eLab, the Lab to Market program out of Columbia, or I3 out of Mount Sinai, as well as open events and programming at institutions such as the New York Stem Cell Foundation, New York Genome Center, or New York Bio. Through these in regular times, there are hundreds of in-person events for scientists, founders, and employees to build off their ideas. I've been pretty amazed over the past 8 months that these programs and events, much like New York City Builds Bio Plus, are continuing in a virtual setting. And while we want to get these back to in-person events, the community is still really at large in helping keep this sense of community even in these times. So whether you're a serial founder or just starting off early in your career, you have quite a bit of a community you can rely on. The next slide, please. So why does all of this real estate matter? For one reason, our youth are counting on it. In 2017, we launched our Sci NYC internship program. The design was to get New York City students, both undergraduates and graduate students, not only excited about this industry, but also practical experience in labs or in a business setting through a 10 to 12 week paid internship program. The interest of this has been outstanding. We went from over 500 applications in our first year to over 1,400 this past spring. 80 New York City life science companies have hosted interns over the past 3 summers. In these initial years, we've seen about 40% of the roughly 300 students get continuing offers. Just this past summer, our partners at Upper West Strategies placed over 70 students. Even despite COVID, they were able to get remote working paid internships, and they're actively recruiting for summer of 2021. After spending some time with these students this past summer and previous years, it's easy to recognize we've got future ambassadors for the industry in New York City, but they're eventually looking to be leading some of these companies. For any out there who might be interested in hosting an intern, learning more about the program, or have an interest in additional ideas, I encourage you to reach out to myself, Upper West Strategies, or our team. So as you work through scaling each of your developments in this space, recognize that not only are your partners, investors, life science companies counting on you, but also the next generation of New York City talent is keeping an eye on the real estate developments. Next slide, please. Shifting over to real estate, I wanted to start with incubators. For years, as you know, New York City did not have the right amount of wet lab incubators to support the innovations coming out of our universities and research centers. Today, as you know, that landscape has drastically changed. We now have 5 active wet lab incubators stretching from West Harlem to Crown Heights. This means we've tripled the amount of wet lab space for incubators in just a few years. Over 75 companies can access specialized equipment, have flexible leasing terms, and be close to other entrepreneurs growing their companies. In 2017, momentum for this activity really kicked off with the following. Alexandria opened their first wet lab incubator in the West Tower. This is Launch Labs, Alexandria's first global incubator, and a model they have since replicated with roughly 10 openings across the US. As Eric mentioned, Empire State Development announced that J Labs would open in the New York Genome Center, and EDC offered a $5 million grant awarding biolabs at NYU Langone alongside Bristol Myers Squibb and the state, which was the first award out of the Sci NYC initiative. These incubators have opened and are continuing to open at a pace of about 1 a year, which we anticipate will continue. Late last year, Biolabs opened their 50,000 square foot wet lab incubator, which has been greatly successful and already houses over 30 startups since its recent opening. We were excited to see that IndieBio is coming to New York. Congrats again to Eric and the state for making that happen. They'll be a great addition to the ecosystem, and you'll be hearing from Nolan later today, and I think Nancy said Poe at some point next week. Soon, Launch Labs will open near Columbia University's Medical Center. As you progress through the conference today and next week, I'd encourage you to ask what these incubators can translate into additional real estate development and potential for each of your projects. As companies graduate from these spaces, they need their own dedicated space to hire teams and develop science. Next slide, please. As incubators started to spring up through New York City, many had concerns about the lack of graduation space in the market. This is where we started to see some creativity within the real estate community. In 2017, Taconic announced with Silverstein that they would redevelop an old movie studio on West 54th Street. The anchor tenant for that development was the New York City Stem Cell Foundation, which built out a state-of-the-art facility. This was a big bet at the time, but one that has and continues to pay off as it evolves. I suspect Matt will cover this in the next panel. The following year showed a significant amount of investment coming from Alexandria. At that time, they made investments in Long Island City, purchased the rights to Pfizer's headquarters on East 42nd Street, and announced in partnership with NYC EDC plans to develop the North Tower. In spring of 2019, the Janus Property Group broke ground in Manhattanville with a 350,000 square foot property targeting life sciences. The property had support from both the city and state. And in September, we announced a partnership with Deerfield, one of the largest global healthcare investors, who committed over $600 million to develop 345 Park Avenue South into a 300,000 square foot life science campus. This was the first award of the Life Science Applied Campus, RFEI, and we offered tax abatements to support this program. I'll let Alex speak in the next panel more about the project, but we're at the city excited about this partner for a number of reasons. Deerfield has formed academic partnerships across the United States to increase early stage investing and translate this science to treatments and products for patients. Each of these collaborations have the potential to form new companies. Deerfield has two of these partnerships locally with Columbia and the Tri-Eye Institute program. They have the ability to bring some of these new companies formed both locally as well as throughout the US into New York City and be a part of this community. Deerfield has also had a deep commitment to talent. We've seen that firsthand through their efforts with CUNY and their fellowship program, hosting Sci NYC interns and programs to elevate women in this industry. As part of our agreement with Deerfield, they've committed up to $30 million to support programming, talent, diversity, and company growth throughout the ecosystem over the next 20 years. We're excited to partner with them and love the commitment that Deerfield has to elevating New York City life sciences. Across the river, we've seen quite a bit of activity lately in Long Island City. Last year, EDC partnered with King Street Partners and local real estate developer GFP to break ground on InnoLabs, over 250,000 square foot development that will be able to capture growth for those coming out of New York City's wet lab incubators. This partnership was a great example of a Boston-based life science developer entering New York City by partnering with a local firm who had no prior experience in this sector. Long Island City is an area that has long been talked about in this community and ripe for life sciences. A few years ago, the Long Island City Partnership, the state, and East Egg Management issued a report highlighting the potential for live, work, play in this area. Based on the InnoLabs project, Alexandria's investments, and some additional recent activity, it's exciting to see how this neighborhood is coming into a budding life sciences cluster. I know Rob's on the next panel and can touch more on why they were interested in coming into New York City and how this exciting project is coming along. There are certainly more developments than the ones I mentioned are on these slides. Biobat, part of the Brooklyn Army Terminal, is an option to capture growth. And I think Guy will speak to some of the activity up and around Morris Park later today, which brings us to where we are today. Companies are starting to see a path to grow in New York City at all stages of growth. We're starting to see companies need and want to take dedicated space for their own. Some examples of this: Hybercell, a Mount Sinai spinout with contributions from the Partnership for New York, partnerships with Eli Lilly, a large funding round in 2019 from Arch, including dollars from EDC, built out 15,000 square feet in that old movie studio with labs built, I believe, in around 6 months. Velastra is a Weill Cornell Memorial Sloan Kettering spinout focused on metastatic cancer, which recently outgrew J Labs and now is in 10,000 square feet of dedicated lab and office space in the Mink building near the Tasty building in Manhattanville. As these companies continue to grow and the space comes online, we'll see more of these step out spaces pop up online. And just think about who's investing in these properties. Traditional New York City developers who had no life science experience, but saw the opportunity for investment and building in a critical industry. The largest life science real estate investment trust, that's doubling down in their initial development from 2010, and doing this in 3 to 4 different geographies throughout New York City. Life science developers like King Street from other markets that have been watching New York City closely over the past 5 years. They're now forming local ventures relying on local expertise to create successful projects. And a large healthcare investor who saw an opportunity to do something well beyond their investment thesis, bring a building, their business acumen, programming that will expand well beyond their real estate footprint. These organizations are taking big bets, getting creative with space and investments, and partnering to build this market. The next slide, please. Before we go to Q&A, I want to highlight a number of the components of our ecosystem. While this isn't exhaustive, it's meant to illustrate the market we've created in partnership with the private sector and the partnerships that are building this industry. The innovations, talent, and investments coming out of these groups will lead to the growth in the real estate market for the rest of the century. Remember, we've got great innovation and talent out of our academic medical centers and research institutions. When the city and state first launched these programs, New York City's NIH funding was just $1.5 million annually. It's now $2 billion annually and second largest market in the world. You could advance it, please. And one more time. Since these programs launched, we've seen venture capital investment grow from over $150 million annually to well over $1 billion. Wow. In 2019, the New York City Healthcare Business Leaders Venture Capital Report saw the amount of funds invested across life sciences companies and digital health to amount to over $2.6 billion, a 41% increase from the $1.85 billion invested the year before. Probably around $1 billion of this is life science and biotech investing, but up significantly from that $150 million annual rate we saw just a few years ago. Even in 2020, we've seen some significant raises in market activity despite COVID and a tough economic conditions. Over 30 companies have raised over $10 million in VC funding since the pandemic started. That's a sign of the commitment and importance to the industry, but also that great science in New York City is getting funded. Could advance, please. Additionally, you're seeing large exposure of pharmaceutical companies, large pharma companies. I mentioned Pfizer, but you're also seeing both physical headquarters, whether it's office space or R&D efforts out of companies like Roivant, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb. Eric mentioned J Labs entering and Johnson & Johnson's footprint in New York City. And then there are partnerships where organizations like Takeda and Boehringer Ingelheim are partnering locally with academic institutions and counting on developing that science even more. We're seeing more and more interest of this big pharma. They're participating in ways that both suit their models, but it's clear that they want access to great science and the talent that New York City has to offer. If you could advance, please. While these macro trends are great and show the momentum of the region, we've had a number of great success stories in New York City. This is a wide variety of New York City life science companies. We expect this section to grow significantly over the years and reflect the great science and talent that we have. By no means is this exhaustive, but it shows the example of companies that might have started here, are focusing their R&D efforts here, may have more of a technology twist, but either way, they're choosing to have a significant presence in New York City. All of this is to say that if you've been in the ecosystem the past decade, you can really see that New York City has come a long way. Efforts of many on this slide and well beyond were able to get New York City out of a very dark time in New York this past spring. Our team was inspired by the willingness of the community to help share, open up technologies across academic medical centers, hospital foundations, industry, and emerging startups. New York City would not be where it is today if not for these partnerships and relationships. It provided even more evidence that prior investment paid dividends, but also additional investment would be required. We look forward to working with the ecosystem to build off the foundation over the past 5 years and lead New York City into recovery. Thanks again for having me, Nancy and Mitch. And at this point, I'm happy to take questions.